Bible class today is on Mark chapter 7. If you would, please turn in your Bibles to this passage and let's begin our study. Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. In verse 1, then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. In verses 1 through 13, we see how Jesus' disciples are accused of eating with defiled hands. Verse 1, the Pharisees and scribes came together to him. And so earlier we see how Mark recorded how Jesus was in the land of Gennesaret in Mark 6 and 53. Capernaum was nearby Gennesaret on the western border of the Sea of Galilee. The Pharisees and the scribes came together to him. The Pharisees were a sect of Judaism noted for their strict observance of the law. They insisted on following their own traditions concerning the law. The scribes were teachers of the law. They may have come from Jerusalem for the express purpose of finding fault with Jesus and his disciples. Remember earlier how the scribes came down from Jerusalem and accused Jesus of having Beelzebub in Mark 3 and 22. Verse 2, now when they saw some of his disciples eat with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. The Pharisees and the scribes saw some of the disciples of Jesus eating bread with defiled hands. The same term is also translated common in Acts 10:14, verse 28, and Acts 11 and verse 8. Mark clarifies eating with defiled hands as eating with unwashed hands. The disciples omitted the ceremonial washing of hands as required by the tradition of the elders. Verse 3, for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. Mark comments on the ceremonial washing of hands, perhaps for the readers who were not familiar with the tradition, as we see in Mark 7, 3 and 4. The tradition of ceremonial hand washing originated with the elders of the Jews. Prior to eating, they would wash their hands in a special way. This is literally with the fist. Other versions may read properly or a ceremonial washing. So, regardless of the specific details, we see that they would engage in hand washing before the meal, not for the purpose of hygiene, but as a ceremonial observance of this tradition. Verse 4, when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Coming from the marketplace, they would be defiled, unclean. Therefore, they did not eat unless they ceremonially washed. Other traditions that they received from the elders included the ceremonial washing of cups and pitchers and copper vessels and couches. The term wash is from the same term rendered baptized in Mark 1:5 and also verses 8 and 9. This word means to dip or immerse or to submerge. And so we see how that they had all kinds of ways that they would practice this tradition, various washings of different implements, in addition to washing their hands in this special way. Mark 7 in verse 5, he said, then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but to eat bread with unwashed hands? So verse 5 we see how they said, according to Matthew 15, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. Matthew 15 and verse 2. Jesus did not answer their specific question. His disciples did transgress the tradition of the elders, but the Pharisees and scribes also transgressed the commandment of God because of their traditions. Matthew 15 and 3, Matthew said in his account how that he answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? Verse 6, he answered and said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Jesus answered the Pharisees and scribes by citing Isaiah the prophet in Isaiah 29 and verse 13. Therefore the Lord said, inasmuch as these people draw near to me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but have removed their hearts far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the commandment of men. And so here in verse 6, Jesus introduced the prophecy of Isaiah by rebuking these scribes and Pharisees as hypocrites. They were like stage actors who put on a show. They put on masks and pretended to be what they were not. They professed to follow the law, but they transgressed the law by their own tradition. Jesus applied the prophecy of Isaiah to the Pharisees and the scribes who found fault with his disciples. They honored God with their lips, but their heart was far from him. Verse 7, that is from the Lord. Verse 7, we see how that they worship God, but they worship God in vain. Their worship was fruitless. Yes, they honored him with their lips, but they did not honor him sincerely with their heart. He said, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And so their teachings are merely these human rules. They cared more for the commandments of men than the commandments of God. They may not have said that, but in their actions they proved that that was the case. Verse 8, for laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups and many other things you do. The Pharisees and scribes were guilty of laying aside the commandment of God. They neglected, or they left behind, they let go of the commandments of God in order to hold on to the traditions of men, to the traditions of the elders passed down. Mark 7, 3 and 5. These traditions, including the ceremonial washing of pitchers and cups and many other things, as he's mentioned some of those things here in this chapter. Verse 9, Mark continues, how that Jesus said to them, all too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. And so Jesus repeats his rebuke, this time with emphasis. They did lay aside the commandments of God in order to hold on to the traditions of men. Jesus said, all too well. Or the idea, you're great at this, you're experts. They were experts of what they did. They not only laid aside the commandment of God, he said, they reject the commandment. They preferred to keep the traditions of the elders than to keep the commandments of God, all too well. So you're doing a great job at rejecting the commandment of God in order that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. So Jesus gave an example from the law. Note that he attributed the scripture to Moses. He gave the commandment of the law, honor your father and your mother. You might read in Exodus 20 and 12, for instance, the Ten Commandments. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon land which the Lord your God is giving you. And so God gave to Moses to give to the children of Israel these commandments, one of which, honor your father and your mother. Exodus 21 and 17, and he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. So Israel, who was under the law, would also have consequences for disobeying the law. Leviticus 20 and 9, for everyone who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. He who's cursed his father or mother, his blood shall be upon him. And so those who persisted in these things and sinning against God and man, against his father and mother, we see that there would be consequences. Verse 11, Jesus continues, but you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban, that is a gift to God. By the tradition of the law, a man was to honor his father and mother. However, by tradition, a son might tell his father and mother that whatever profit or whatever help he would have given to help them, his father and mother, was Corban or Corban. The term described a gift or offering to God. And so therefore, by tradition, the man laid aside the commandment to honor his father and mother. He laid it aside in order to hold on to the tradition. Perhaps saying Corban, let them know this is a gift to God. This is an offering made to God. And so I cannot give this to you. It's already been consecrated to God. Verse 12. Then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. That is, the Pharisees and the scribes no longer let the man who would say Corban do anything else for his father or mother. Perhaps he said that and maybe he regretted it and later repented. He would have to break the commandment or break the tradition, and the Pharisees, the scribes, would not let him do it. It says, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. May also have been that the man offered an excuse why not to honor his father and mother, to help his father and mother, by saying he gave a gift to God, and so that he had no longer a gift to give to his parents. Verse 12, so the Pharisees would not permit him, the man who vowed Corban, gift to God, to help his parents, to keep the commandment. Verse 13, he said, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such things you do. The term tradition is not a bad word. Tradition simply means to hand something down. You hand down doctrine, you hand down lessons, word. And in this case here, they're handing down this matter. And Jesus reproves them. Verse 13, through their tradition, the word of God was made of no effect. It was rendered void or nullified. It was deprived of force and authority. This was not their only example. This was not the only example that Jesus could give. There were many others of how they set aside the commandment of God in order to hold their tradition. In verses 14 to 23, we see how Jesus teaches what really defiles a man. Verse 14, when he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. And so Jesus called the multitude, he called the crowd to himself. The Pharisees and the scribes were still present. And so he spoke to the crowd of people, and he exhorted them to hear and to understand. He said, there is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. So the Pharisees and the scribes found fault with the disciples of Jesus for eating bread with defiled or unwashed hands. as they did not first ceremonially wash according to their tradition before they ate. Jesus taught with authority that eating food with unwashed hands does not defile a man. He taught the multitude with this parable in Mark 7 and 17. According to Matthew's account, Matthew 15 and 11, Jesus taught not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, that defiles a man. And so speaking of one's words, and also included, as we see later, would be his actions. Verse 16, if anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. And so Jesus called for the people to listen, to pay attention. We see these words earlier in Mark 4 and 9, and also verse 23, that if anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. He used these words on various occasions. Verse 17. And we want to note that some versions omit this passage because it's absent in some manuscripts. However, it's found in other passages, like we mentioned, such as in the verses just mentioned. Verse 17, when he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So Jesus and his disciples, they entered a house away from the crowd. Whose house was it? Well, we're not told. His disciples asked him about the parable in Mark 7, 14 to 16. According to Matthew's account, it was the disciple Peter who asked Jesus to explain the parable to them. Let's read that passage. Matthew 15, 12 to 15. Then his disciples came to him and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? But he answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch. Then Peter answered and said to him, explain this parable to us. So Jesus taught that to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. Matthew 15 and 20. However, the lesson may extend beyond reproving the tradition of ceremonially washing hands before eating food. Under the law of Moses, there were certain animals which were considered unclean. There were foods which were permitted, and there were foods which were forbidden under the law of Moses. Leviticus 11, verses 1 to 23. With some animals being considered unclean. Leviticus 11, 34 to 47. Meat from unclean animals was considered unclean, according to Deuteronomy 14, 3 to 21. According to Leviticus 11:43, they were not to eat unclean meat lest they themselves become ceremonially unclean or defiled. Leviticus 11:43. Remember, these regulations were given by Moses to the people of Israel. These were for those who were under the law. These dietary requirements of the law were given to set Israel apart as a holy people to the Lord. Deuteronomy 14 and 21. The reason for these regulations, again, was for the purpose of setting Israel apart from the nations, from the Gentiles, as a people holy to the Lord. And so these regulations, these requirements were given to Israel, again, who were under the law. And with the death of Christ, we see that are no longer enforced today, according to Colossians 2 and 14. Also look at 1 Timothy 4, 3 to 4, where we see how that Paul told Timothy that if one is thankful to God, then certainly he can eat these things. Leviticus 11, 44 to 45. Note a passage that I cited earlier. Leviticus 11, 44 to 45. Moses wrote the word of God. It says, for I am the Lord your God, you shall therefore consecrate yourself, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. And so again, these requirements were to set Israel apart from the other nations, for them to be holy in the eyes of God. Jesus, by his authority, may also be teaching that foods themselves do not defile a man. It's not until later, after Peter, for example, sees the vision of the Lord saying, "Arise, Peter, kill and eat," that he ultimately understands. What God has cleansed, God said, you must not call common. Acts 10 and verse 15. Verse 18. So he said to them, "Are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him?" So the disciples of Jesus did not understand. He taught, "There's nothing that enters a man from the outside which can defile him." Verse 15. Now Jesus repeats the parable. He says in verse 19, "Because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods." So here in verse 19, Jesus gives the reason why these things cannot defile him. After eating, the food is digested in the stomach, and the waste is eliminated or expelled from the body. It does not enter the heart or the mind. And so he continues in verse 20. What comes out of a man, that defiles a man, Jesus said. So the things that come out of the heart of man are the things that defile a man. Jesus lists those things of sin which come from the heart. It is sin which defiles man. Evil thoughts proceed from the heart in word and in deed. Matthew chapter 15 and 18, Matthew said in his account, "But those things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man." And so it wasn't, the disciples were not at fault in the eyes of God for not washing their hands in a special way, according to the tradition passed down from the elders of washing their hands before they ate. Their hands were not defiled. According to God, they were not unclean in the eyes of God. They may have been unclean or defiled in the eyes of the Pharisees and the scribes, having violated their traditions. However, they had not broken the law. We see here that he goes on to describe the things that come out of a man, the things that come out of a man's heart. These are the things that truly defile a man in the eyes of God. Sin. Verse 21. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders. And so here's part of the list in verse 21. He begins with evil thoughts. And so it's evil thoughts which come from the heart or from the mind. It is from these evil thoughts that we sin. And these are and include adulteries and fornications. These include all acts of sexual immorality, whatever they may be. Adultery and fornication are said to proceed from lust, according to Matthew 5:27 to verse 30. He also lists murderers. And so there are murderers. These include acts of shedding innocent blood. The cause of murder is often anger or hate, which comes, again, from the heart. Again, look at Matthew 5:21 to 26, where Jesus taught this lesson as well. And so these things come out of man, out of the heart of man, and these are the things that defile a man. Adulteries, fornications, murders. Verse 22, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. There are several here, and we have just a little time to look at each one. He begins by saying in verse 22, there are thefts. These include the unlawful taking of property, whether pilfering or robbery. Stealing is often preceded by greed. Again, things that come out of a man, out of a man's heart. One of which is greed or covetousness, as we see next in this passage. Again, we want to note that under the law, the Jews were commanded not to steal, not to commit adultery, or not to commit covetousness. Thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not steal. And so here, there is covetousness. This is marked by an inordinate desire for wealth or possessions. Again, greed. Covetousness is a form of idolatry, according to Colossians 3 and 5. Of course, according to the Ten Commandments, the Jews were not to commit idolatry. But we also see that covetousness is a form of idolatry, according to the Apostle Paul. Other acts of sin often spring from covetousness. Paul wrote, for example, in 1 Timothy 6 and 10, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And so all kinds of evil acts come from covetousness, love of money, greed. Next, he says there is wickedness. And so this is moral depravity. You see a progression from bad to worse. It's the state of being morally bad, very, very bad, being marked by corruption or perversion, wickedness. There's also deceit. This is another word for deception. It's the opposite of sincerity that is taught by Christ and his disciples. Of course, sincerity begins in the heart. Deceit comes from the heart of some people. There is lewdness. Some versions may read lasciviousness or sensuality. And so this refers to someone who is sexually unchaste or licentious, someone who lacks moral restraint, especially sexual restraint. And so some versions read lasciviousness or sensuality for lewdness in this passage. There's also an evil eye. What's an evil eye? Well, some versions may read envy. Well, an evil eye is someone is the practice of someone looking at another as though to inflict injury. The evil eye desires to harm or desires harm to come to someone else. One who is envious has a painful awareness of an advantage enjoyed by another, combined perhaps with a desire to inflict pain on them and to possess the same advantage. And so the evil eye or envy. There's also blasphemy. The term blasphemy simply means to speak evil against. It may be in reference to God or it may be in reference to man. If one speaks against God, it's blasphemy. If a man is speaking against another man, it's slander. Of course, man can blaspheme another man too. It just means to slander. In this case, to speak evil against, to defame, to injure the reputation of another. There's also pride. This is excessive appreciation of one's own worth, conceit. You look down on others with disdain. Those who are haughty or those who are arrogant often look down on others with disdain or a lack of respect, reproach. There's also foolishness. This may refer to foolish talking or could be foolish behavior or both. Ephesians 5 and 4 and also Ephesians 5 and 15 use similar language. If you compare Mark's account in Mark 7 with Matthew's account in Matthew 15:19, you see that Matthew also includes the false witness as another example of what coming out of a man's heart, is what really defiles a man, these things of sin, such as being false witness. Of course, this too was also condemned under the law of Moses, particularly in the Ten Commandments. This is the man who gives untrue testimony. Verse 23, all these things come from within and defile a man, Jesus said. It's evil that comes from within man, out of the heart of a man, that defiles or makes a man unclean in the eyes of God. Those things that proceed from the heart, these are the things that defile a man. These are things that defile us. Matthew 15 and 20, in Matthew's account, he says, these are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. So Jesus in Matthew's account makes the point that was initially brought up by the Pharisees and the scribes against Jesus' disciples, that they saw his disciples eating with unwashed hands or defiled hands. Jesus points out here in Matthew 15 and 20 that these things that come from a man's heart, words and actions, sin defiles a man, not to eat with unwashed hands. It was contrary to the tradition of the Pharisees and the scribes. However, it was not contrary to God. And unfortunately, we see that some were willing to let go of the commandments of God in order to hold on to their own traditions. Number 3, we see how Jesus heals the daughter of a Syro-Phoenician woman in Mark 7, 24 to 30. Verse 24, it says, from there he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he entered a house and wanted no one to know it, but he could not be hidden. Jesus arose and he left Galilee. He went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. These were the cities of ancient Phoenicia. At the time of the ministry of Jesus, these cities, located in Syria, were northwest of Capernaum of Galilee, bordering the Mediterranean Sea. We see here that Jesus entered a house. This may be the house of a friend, or this may be the house of a stranger. Perhaps the stranger is showing hospitality to Jesus. The text itself does not say. We do see that Jesus wanted no one to know that he was staying there in the house. However, his presence was not hidden for very long. Why did Jesus not want anyone to know that he was staying there? Perhaps what follows will help explain. Verse 25, for a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. So there was a woman who heard about Jesus. The reputation, the works of Jesus had extended far and wide. She knew where Jesus was staying. Apparently, she had also heard of his power to heal and to cast out demons. She herself had a young daughter who had an unclean spirit. And so she came to Jesus and she fell at his feet. According to Matthew's account in Matthew 15:22, it says, and behold, a woman of Canaan came from the region and cried out to him, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed. And so this woman of Canaan land, Phoenicia. And so this Phoenician woman, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. And so she knew of Jesus, and she had heard that Jesus was there at the house. She knew where to find him, and she found him. And she came and she fell down at his feet. Verse 26. The woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. The woman was said to be a Greek, or some versions read Gentile, one who was not a Jew. She was a Phoenician of Syria, That's what he means by Syro-Phoenician. She was a Phoenician, or of Canaan, of this place of Syria. In the past, it was known as Phoenicia. And so she kept on asking Jesus to cast the demon, or this unclean spirit, out of her daughter. Looking now at Matthew's account in Matthew 15 and 23 to 25, according to Matthew, it says, "But he answered her not a word. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, 'Send her away, for she cries out after us.' But he answered and said, 'I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.' Then she came and worshipped him, saying, 'Lord, help me.'" When Mark talks about how she fell down at his feet in verse 25, fell down at his feet to worship him. And so here we see the disciples were with Jesus, and the disciples certainly were not complimentary toward her or compassionate toward her in that sense. We note here that Jesus points out that he was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And we see that here in the next verse, verse 27. "But Jesus said to her, 'Let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and to throw it to the little dogs.'" And so Jesus uses this metaphor in order to teach. And I think ultimately to bring out, to give an occasion for the great faith of this Syro-Phoenician woman, this Gentile. And so, according to verse 27, Jesus was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Again, he was sent primarily in his mission to the Jews. That was his primary ministry at this time. Matthew 15 and 24. During his ministry, he primarily went to the Jews, to the house of Israel, and not to the Gentiles. Now, we'll see later on with the Great Commission that Jesus commands his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. We see in Mark 16, 15, and 16. "He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. He who does not believe shall be condemned." So the Great Commission is great, one, because it was for everyone, Jew and Gentile. So Jesus here uses this metaphor of the little dogs in order to teach this lesson to his disciples who were standing thereby as well. But also, I think, to provide an occasion for the great faith of this woman. We want to note here that some Greek families particularly had dogs as pets. However, the children in the house would eat before the dogs. It would not be good, of course, to take bread intended for the children in order to give it to the dogs, to the little dogs, to their pets. And so Jesus makes this the point. His point is that he's sent to the Jews and not to the Gentiles. This woman was a Gentile woman, and so his ministry was for the Jews and not the Gentiles. Now, how did the woman respond to this metaphor that Jesus taught? Verse 28, it says in verse 28 that she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." And so the woman answered him by conceding that he was right. However, she points out that as the children eat, the little dogs eat the crumbs that fall under the table. According to Matthew 15:27, it says, "And she said, 'Yes, Lord, even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table.'" Verse 29, "Then he said to her, 'For this saying, go your way. The demon has gone out of your daughter.'" Jesus had no intention of leaving this woman without helping her daughter, but he provides this occasion for her faith. And we see that the disciples hopefully learned a lesson that day as well. Verse 29, Jesus commends the faith of the woman, as was shown in her saying. It says, for this saying, for what she had to say, which demonstrated her faith. So in Matthew 15:28, Jesus answered and said to her, O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. She desired that Jesus heal her daughter, and so she was healed. Matthew chapter 15 and 28. Here in verse 30, Mark continues, and when she had come to her house, she found the demon gone out, and her daughter lying on the bed. When the woman came home to her house, she found that her daughter was lying on the bed. She was now able to lie on the bed and to rest. The demon had finally left her, and so there was peace. One curiosity might be, wonder if this woman had little dogs. Well, of course, the text does not say, but something curious to think about. Number 4, we see how Jesus heals a man who is deaf and mute in verses 31 to 37. Verse 31, again departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. You remember how that he first left Galilee in order to go to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And now he's departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, and it says how he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. So he departs from Tyre, from that place, Tyre and Sidon. However, he did not return to Galilee, the place that he left. Instead, he skirted the Sea of Galilee on the eastern side to the region of Decapolis. You might remember Decapolis from our earlier study in Mark. Mark chapter 5 and verse 20. Remember how earlier Jesus healed the man who was demon-possessed, and how the man afterward proclaimed in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, as Jesus had instructed him to do, to go and to tell his friends. From what Mark writes, it appears that there were many who had heard the testimony of the man and believed. Why do we say that? Well, from what follows, verse 32. Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to put his hand on him. So people from the region of Decapolis brought to Jesus one who was deaf. He also had an impediment in his speech. Some refer to this man as a deaf mute. However, it appears that he was not completely mute, but only that he had an impediment in his speech. Another reason for that is that if you read later, after Jesus heals the man in verse 35, it says how he spoke plainly. So he could speak, apparently, but he could not speak plainly. And so he had an impediment, a speech impediment, some kind of speech disorder of some kind. And so the people begged Jesus to put his hand on the man. If you remember from our previous studies, we see how that people thought if only Jesus could touch them, or that if they could even touch Jesus, or even touch the hem of the garment of Jesus, they could be healed. Of course, none of that was necessary. Jesus could simply heal with a word. And he didn't need to be in the presence of the people who he would heal. He could do from a great distance. Jesus was not limited as to be required to touch in order to heal, or even to be in the same area as the person being healed. Verse 33. And he took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears and spat and touched his tongue. Jesus did not heal the man in front of the multitude. He could have, but he did not. Instead, he took the deaf man aside from the multitude, from the crowd. Jesus, again, could have put his hand on the man and could have healed him. He could have healed him before the crowd. However, Jesus took the man aside. It appears as though Jesus is making these gestures for the benefit of the deaf man, the man with the speech impediment. As the man could not hear, Jesus put his fingers in his ear. As the man had a speech impediment, Jesus spat and then touched the man's tongue. This may be a demonstration of the power of God. This may all be for his benefit. Again, Jesus could have simply said a word and the man be healed. Or the man could have touched him, he could have touched the man. Regardless, we see that he could have been healed by the power of God. He was. But we see this, it appears all for his benefit. And so Jesus spat, he didn't touch the man's tongue. He may have touched his tongue with the saliva. There was nothing in the saliva, no medicinal purpose of the saliva. All this is due to the power of God. And the things that he did in this unusual manner here, he's done on other occasions, again, may be for the benefit of the man. Note how later Jesus heals a blind man much the same way as he heals the deaf man here in this passage, later in Mark 8:22-26. We'll get to that, Lord willing, in a later lesson. Verse 34. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And so here Jesus spoke a word, according to Mark, of Aramaic. And we see that he looked up to heaven. Of course, his Father in heaven. Mark wrote that he sighed. Sometimes we sigh when troubled or disturbed in some way. Here, Jesus looks up to heaven and he sighs. He had compassion on the man, sorrow for the man's condition. Looks up to heaven, looks up to his Father in heaven, he sighs. Perhaps the sigh is a silent prayer, a prayer of the heart. But we see that he sighs, and the man was deaf, and the man could not hear. However, the man might have been able to read his lips, as is often the case. And so Jesus spoke to him in Aramaic, be opened. People often looked at the deaf as having their ears closed. And as he was deaf, his ears were thought to be closed. And so Jesus used a word that people knew, be opened. Verse 35. Immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. The man was healed immediately. There was no rehabilitation. There was no lengthy treatment schedule. Immediately his ears were opened. There was nothing medicinal, again, about the saliva. His ears were closed. Now they were open. He could now hear. His tongue, which was bound, was now loosed. He could now speak plainly. There was now no speech impediment, no speech disorder. Verse 36, then he commanded them that they should tell no one. But the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. As at other times, like Mark 1:45, we see Jesus told the people that they should tell no one. He had different reasons at different times. For example, in Mark 1:45, it appears the reason was that by telling everybody it would make him difficult to do his ministry. So many people at one time, he could not even enter the city easily into Capernaum. Despite what he told them, it says that the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed how Jesus made the deaf to hear and this man with the speech impediment to be able to speak plainly. Verse 36, they proclaimed it. It's interesting that earlier in Decapolis, the example we mentioned earlier of how Jesus healed the man with the unclean spirits, that was in Decapolis. He told him to go home and stay and tell people. Now, the people have heard about Jesus. Many who've heard about him, they've come, the multitude has come to see Jesus and ask him to heal this man and others. We now see Jesus saying that they ought to tell no one. Again, it may be because of the difficulty of doing his work, getting around from place to place. It would be hard to do so with a great multitude thronging you, pressing about you. So that might have been a reason. But the more he commanded them, whatever the reason was, the more they proclaimed it. This was too big to keep secret. When Jesus went to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he met the woman, the Syrophoenician woman, at first we see how that he had told them, not to tell anybody that he was staying there, but they found out anyway. Verse 37, they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. So learning how Jesus healed the man, opening his ears and loosening his tongue, the people were astonished beyond measure. This reminds me of Mark 6:51, where the disciples were astonished beyond measure when Jesus came to them walking on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus did other miracles as well. They said he has done all things well. Again, there appears to have been others who were deaf and mute. There was this man that Mark talks about in Mark 7, the man who was deaf and had the speech impediment, but there appears to be others who may have been deaf and mute and had other illnesses. And Jesus performed these miracles to demonstrate that the gospel of the kingdom was true. Matthew 15:29-31. According to Matthew, Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up on the mountain and sat down there. Then great multitudes came to him, having with them the lame, blind, mute, maimed, and others, many others. And they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. So the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. And so according to Matthew's account, Matthew 15:29-31, there were other miracles performed besides the man who was deaf and had the impediment of speech. All this to the glory of God, the God of Israel. The people praised God. We hope that you have learned, benefited from the lesson today, and we invite you to come back next time. And Lord willing, we'll be here again with the next chapter, Mark chapter 8. We hope to see you then and that you're able to join us at that time. Thank you for being here.